We go. Good morning. Nice to see all of you. I'm Elisa Halpern-Paul, and I had the pleasure and honor of being the meeting facilitator at the 2020 IVI Summit. And it's wonderful to be together, even in this virtual environment, to continue the important conversation that we began last year about putting the patient at the center of value assessment. I have the honor of introducing Annie Kennedy in a moment, and I wanted just to tell a brief story that connects Annie to value assessment and to this patient panel. So I had the pleasure of getting to know Annie probably 5 or 6 years ago now, Annie, I've lost track, in our work for a wonderful organization called Cure SMA. And at the time, there were no FDA-approved treatments, you'll remember, Annie. And one of the things we were doing was talking to patients about what was most important to them in a therapy or an intervention. And I had the pleasure of meeting a young man about the age of 30 who had lived with SMA, and he could not walk. And he expressed to me that he didn't need to ever walk. That was not an expectation that he had or needed. His need was to not lose any more functionality. So the story he told me was he was strong enough and able to pull open the refrigerator and get food for himself and for his family members. And at age 30, that was important. And he wanted a treatment that would allow him at age 50 or 60 to still open the refrigerator. He didn't have the expectation that a treatment might allow him to walk, which he never had been able to do. But for him, his patient preference was to not get any worse in his condition. And that story stuck with me because in having that conversation with him, he said that wasn't what clinicians wanted for him. That wasn't what payers wanted for him. And that wasn't what regulators wanted for him. They wanted for him to walk. And of course, he said, if that's in the cards for me, that's great. But really, my priority is not to get any worse. And that was what his value system was and what he wanted payers and regulators to understand from his perspective. And so in that work that we did, Annie, I feel like I gained an important perspective in understanding that each patient has his or her own journey. And what is important to one patient is their priority. And you've talked to one patient, and you cannot generalize across an entire population. And in that work, I came to really appreciate Annie as a patient advocate, and I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to kick off our wonderful panel, which really is putting the patients at the center of this conversation. And I do hope that everyone had the opportunity to review the 2 case studies that were prepared by 2 of our panelists this morning. I want to thank them for taking the time to do that. If you haven't had a chance to look at those case studies, please do so when you have a moment, either during a break today or later this evening. So Annie Kennedy, thank you so much for helping me really gain perspective on the importance of patient perspective and priorities in this important work. And Annie's day job is the Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement for the Every Life Foundation. Her work is centered on advancing the development of treatment and diagnostic opportunities for rare disease patients through science-driven public policy. She has worked in the rare disease community for nearly 3 decades across a number of organizations, and also serving on the boards of a number of organizations, as well as being in-house staff. And she has helped lead legislative efforts around the passage of policy that is central to improving care to individuals with rare diseases. She's also been very active in Patient-Focused Drug Development Works Coalition, and she equally appreciates the role of the patient and the role of caregivers in this journey that we talk about when we're discussing the challenges that chronic, life-threatening, and disabling conditions bring. So with that, Annie, I'm going to turn it over to you in this wonderful panel, and I'll go off video.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. What a nice introduction. I do want to, before we move into the panel and some introductions of the panelists, I just want to thank IVI for this topic today and this meeting, and for having all of us here on this panel today. And just make some opening comments to maybe set the stage and the context for our discussion here this morning, just to make sure we're starting all from the same place and space. So many of us here today are well aware of a lot of work that's happened in some partnering ecosystems, but we've really had a paradigm shift in the way that patients and patient communities are engaging in therapeutic development, in accessing care. And our patient communities are no longer considered simply end users or consumers within our ecosystem. Many of our communities have become fully engaged citizen scientists, is the way many of us like to think of it and term it. We are really very involved throughout the entire product development lifecycle and serving as catalysts in policies and data collection that are informing development programs, clinical trial design, informing the data elements, endpoints, and outcomes that are actually being collected within clinical trials. We're actually developing frameworks for regulatory review and the patient experience data that's being considered within that regulatory review and approval. And one of the things that happened actually pretty recently within this context was that we're now actually shifting to really work very intentionally to engage within the access ecosystem, to look at how this patient experience data, which actually was codified coming out of 21st Century Cures and PDUFA 6, and the inclusion of this data within the regulatory ecosystem, could now be formally incorporated into the access environment and to decision-making within the access environment. And how could patient communities be more fully incorporated into this environment? And for many of this, the importance of this is not just a nice to have and is not just underscored because of the urgency of the conditions that we and our loved ones are living with, but really is brought to bear because we and our loved ones were hitting a lot of therapeutic access hurdles and system inefficiencies as we're navigating care and access to these newly approved therapies. And so we're finding that that adage of if you're not at the table, you're on the menu is really true. And so we're really trying to take these learnings that we've had within the clinical trial environment and the regulatory environment and apply them now to the access environment. And there's a real urgency for this work. And so we're grateful to IVI and others for really leaning into this and figuring out how we ensure that as we have found that access is being denied or delayed or is hinging sometimes on step therapies and prior authorizations, and many times that's happening because the data that is available, the patient experience data that was available to inform how these products and these access environments or these care environments were developed was not available to inform the access environment. We now need to integrate that. It needs to be central in that decision making. So we have found this to be a critical need to formalize the integration of patient experience data and outcomes and metrics that are valued by patients into these environments. And so today we have a really wonderful panel of esteemed colleagues who are all have experienced this engagement in different ways and are going to talk about this through different lenses. And together we're really going to wend our way through a discussion of the importance of and the importance and the complexities. So I think we need to underscore that of this nascent integration of patient experience data into informing decision making into the healthcare and access environment. And so I'm going to just introduce each of them. All of our bios are on the microsite, so I'm, for the sake of time, not going to take up time reading everyone's bios. And then I'd like to invite each of them to provide a little bit of an introduction of yourselves and your communities and the work that you've been engaged in on behalf of yourself and your community, and just to help set a little context for our discussion from your lab. So first I'm going to introduce Hugo Campos, who's the patient advisor for Stanford Medicine X. We're also joined today by Nathaniel Counts, who's the Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health Innovation at Mental Health America. We also are joined by Mariana Marinak, who's the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at Jdrf International. And then we also have Maggie Jalowski, who's the Director of Advocacy at 6 Cells. So we have a lot of really wonderful communities represented here today that have done some really innovative work in this space. So first, I'd like to actually invite Hugo, if you wouldn't mind first helping us sort of set the stage from your perspective as an individual and a caregiver who's really working to integrate and participate in this ecosystem, to talk a little bit about your perspective and lens on all of this.
All right, well, good morning, and thank you, Annie, for the introduction, and thanks everyone and for having me. I'll start by, I'll tell you a 3-minute story of my background and how I get to be here as a patient and as a caregiver. I was diagnosed with familial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a common type of genetic heart muscle disease in around 2005 or 6. And this is a condition that often puts people at risk for a sudden cardiac arrest, which led me to receiving an implant of an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, like a pacemaker device that treats fast heart rhythms. When I was implanted the ICD, and the doctor said, this is one of the new models of these devices and it will be monitored remotely. And I said, oh, this is very exciting. What is the URL for the patient access to the data that you see? And the doctor's response was surprise, and I said, well, this is not for you. This is for us. It's for clinicians. It's not for the patient. And this started sort of an advocacy on my part, because I found that was unacceptable and quite silly that the patient, the person at the center of the person who's dealing with the condition and trying to manage their own health, would be the only one with no access to the most valuable information that is useful to clinicians to manage a patient's care. So fast forward to today, I have a 91-year-old parent who lives with me, my father, and in fact has been in hospice at home for last 2 months. Thankfully, just graduated out of hospice to home health just this week, and we're happy about that. But what I want to point out about this is that there are several portals that Dad uses, or that I use as I manage his care. His PCP has a portal. His cardiologist has a different portal, is in a different system, and home health has a third completely different portal that surprisingly in 2021 does not provide a patient front end. There's no patient access to the portal, which makes my job terribly difficult as a caregiver and someone who has to manage his weight, monitor his weight, monitor his blood pressure as we adjust medications that he's been having high blood pressure. And we're trying to figure out the best combination of meds to fix that issue, manage his anticoagulation numbers. All of these things become quite difficult to do when I'm dealing with folks who are in 3 completely different systems that don't talk to one another, and one of which is a system that I have no access to. I rely on the nurse who comes to our home to relay the information. So, and if you think about this, I mean, we see, and now that we're in health and home health, we see the nurse once a week, so it's quite frequent. But typically, I see my cardiologist, twice a year for 20 minutes each visit. Dad sees his cardiologist probably just as much, a little more recently. But I'm with him 365 days a year. So it is clear to me that the patient, that the caregiver should be the ones who have the most access to information, the most access to data. At least that's what makes the most sense, because I'm in the thick of it. I'm managing that my dad's condition, and I'm managing my own. So to me, it's clear that in over these 14-year span, from 2006 to today, to 2021, we have yet to solve some of these most, I would say, basic needs of communication and of sharing information with one another, helping coordinate care, empowering the patient to take a more active role in their health. Things have improved, as Annie mentioned, and I agree with that. We have taken many steps in the right direction, but we have not solved some of the very basic and critical issues that continue to be pervasive in this system, which is frankly not really patient-centric. It remains clinic-centric or physician-centric.
Thank you, Hugo. I think we'll have time to come back to some of those opportunities for improvement as we went through the conversation. But I think what you did really beautifully is brought to life that graphic that Rick showed at the beginning in the opening, where he showed all the different areas where data is being collected. In that graphic, the patient was right in the center, but the truth is data is being collected from patients all over the ecosystem, and that is very laborious. It puts a lot of rocks in the backpacks of the patient community. It is very inefficient, and it really adds to the overall impact of the lived experience of being a caregiver and individual with one of our diagnoses. So thank you for really bringing that to light. I think now I'll ask Nathaniel to maybe talk a little bit about your community's experience and some of the work that you've done in this ecosystem.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Nathaniel Counts with Mental Health America, and we're the nation's oldest mental health advocacy organization. And I think the unique thing about, I guess, like mental health and patient perspective is, so Mental Health America was actually founded by a person with lived experience who had spent time inside of inpatient institutions, which became part of like a larger civil rights movement towards deinstitutionalization. Because the mental health for decades, it wasn't as though there was like slight kind of like decisional conflict between the clinician and the patient perspectives. It was like people were trapped in inpatient settings for the rest of their lives often, and given forced treatments against their will, and sometimes even to the degree it became torture, and people died in institutions from preventable causes. And so that's kind of the backdrop on which the mental health community, I think, especially in advocacy, has engaged with lived experience in the past, and like really centering the voices of those with lived experience and their rights. And then that's now, I think, going into the value space with kind of like we come in with, I think, a robust discussion of how patient viewpoints play in. And then I think also in a fear that, because I think mental health can be trickier to measure, which we'll talk about in the next part, than other things, a fear that like value will calcify around relatively arbitrary measures, because you need standards and conventions, and that if there isn't really strong patient engagement from the start, it'll just sort of like take off in a direction that doesn't necessarily make sense for anyone. I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Annie, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was going to say that's a super important point, so we'll make sure we come back to that so you can talk about how that operationalizes within the community. Next, Mariana, can you talk about the work of Jdrf and some of the work that you guys have been doing?
Sure, thanks, Annie. Hi, everybody. I'm Mariana Marinak, and I work for Jdrf International. And I also have type 1 diabetes and have had it for 31 years now. So it's a privilege for me to work for the organization. You know, Jdrf's mission is a world without type 1 diabetes. And our mission is to fund research to accelerate cures and prevention therapies, as well as better treatments for type 1 diabetes and its complications. You know, several years ago, what we identified, and this is, you know, very, very timely for the topic that we're discussing here, is that, and with the advances in technology and how patients care for type 1 diabetes, in particular, technology that's called continuous glucose monitors. So we have the ability today, which we didn't even almost a decade ago, to continuously monitor our blood sugars. These are sensors that patients can wear for, you know, anywhere from 7, 10 to 14 days that continuously monitor your blood sugar and tell you what's going on. And for people with type 1 diabetes and their caregivers, every decision that you make on dosing insulin, which can be a very dangerous drug to dose, is based on that blood sugar level and sort of what's going on around that time of that dosing. And really the burden of and the decision making of treating your disease almost entirely lies with the patient and the caregiver. So the advent of these technologies really gave us a lot more information about what's happening day in and day out, and how to better treat what's happening day in and day out. I will say that also comes with extra burden. Right now you see and hear there's alarms going off at all times of the day, potentially at night, for either yourself or a parent of a child who has type 1. And traditionally, for regulatory purposes and for even payer and reimbursement purposes, the metric that's used to measure care is something called hemoglobin A1C. And hemoglobin A1C is a really important outcome measure. It's one that, better A1Cs mean it reduces your risk of complications, of long-term complications from type 1 diabetes. What these continuous glucose monitors do is give us a quality to what's happening in that A1C, because A1C is an average. It's an average over 3 months of your blood sugars. And what can happen is if you're having lots of high blood sugars and low blood sugars, you can look like your average is fine. But what may be happening is you may be waking up several times a night, or you're having lots of events on the other end, hyperglycemic events, right, that are causing you to not feel well, to impact how you feel and how you function. And what we were seeing even too is the definitions of hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia were so different across the community as you looked at research studies and clinical trials and how they're measured and what was the definition used. There was a lot of inconsistency. So we launched the Outcomes Beyond A1C program here at Jdrf, one to standardize the definition of clinically meaningful outcome measures beyond hemoglobin A1C. And we brought the stakeholder community together. We had a steering committee that really assessed the evidence and the data, brought in the community as advisors to make sure we were doing this right. And one of the other aspects that we found was important, that we wanted to really get patients' perspectives on of these outcomes. What's important to you? What is your patient preference? And so we did a patient preference study, that looked at and asked both patients and caregivers, as we presented hypothetical treatments that varied sort of these outcomes and benefits, what would they choose? And overwhelmingly, patients and caregivers, their preferences were for reductions in the frequency and severity of hypoglycemic events. Those are low blood sugars, and hyperglycemic events. Those are high blood sugars. Yes, we all want cures. We all want to be free from insulin. And Annie, as you sort of mentioned, as the SMA story sort of came about, or Ilse talked about the SMA story earlier, I think for us, there are benefits between what our A1C is and a cure, right? There are things along the way here that are important to us in our lives and our quality of life and how we feel and how we function, that I don't think are adequately getting captured.
I think
we're making efforts there.
Thank you so much, Mariana. We'll come back into that a little bit because a lot of you are referencing some of the work that you've been doing and how some of the findings and learnings are evolving. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit more with everybody. But another group that's done a lot of this work also is Sick Cells. So Maggie, would you talk a little bit about some of your experiences as well to help frame where we can go in the discussion, because you guys have led a lot of work in this space.
Thank you so much, Annie, and to IVI, thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Maggie Jalowski, and I'm the Director of Advocacy with Sick Cells. Sick Cells is a national advocacy organization founded by our president, Ashley Valentine, and her older brother, Marcus. Marcus passed away last June. He was 36 years old with sickle cell. And he's the reason that we continue this work to elevate the voice of the community. Marcus's vision for Sick Cells was to get the stories out there. He wanted the world to know what it was like to live well with sickle cell. Because while so many people saw a passionate sickle cell warrior participating in advocacy events and celebrating new wins for the community, we knew the truth of what was happening in the home, in the clinics, and outside of the public eye. What you didn't see were the primary care visits, the hematologist appointments, the pulmonologist, the infectious disease doctors. You didn't see the weekly blood infusion visits or the enormous amount of pain medications that a warrior must take to manage intense pain crises. You didn't see the family needing to stop everything they were doing to bring their loved one into the ER and combat racism and discrimination in order to receive adequate care, and then sit at the bedside for days, missing work, missing school, needing childcare, and to pay for transportation and meals. Because sickle cell is this invisible disease, our work at Sick Cells is to empower warriors to share these stories, and with the hope that these stories can eliminate stigma, ultimately influence decision makers and propel change. There are nearly 100,000 individuals living with sickle cell disease in the US, though this is an estimate because of the lack of adequate, reliable data. This is a historic time, though, for the sickle cell disease community. After generations of lack of funding, investment, research, treatments, innovation is finally coming. We have new disease-modifying treatments merging onto the market, and it's a time of great optimism because now the conversation is shifting where it's feasible for warriors to make decisions on what treatments and what approaches work best for them, or what combinations of therapies would they prefer. But with this new innovation, as we know, a new conversation becomes important. And we're excited to participate in this work. We've engaged on these topics since 2019, and our organization has done a lot of work to think about patient prioritization, patient preference, what matters most to the patient. We're passionate about advocating for measures and methods that ensure the voice of the sickle cell community is elevated in these assessments, because it's true that traditional value assessments and their methods fail our community. I look forward to this conversation today, and I'm happy to engage in this dialogue and talk a little bit more about what we have found in this work for the sickle cell community.
So thank you guys for those introductions that helped provide a lot of context for our discussion. I guess everybody really did talk about the evolution of your experiences in your communities, how we're at a different point now than we were when your community or your entering the community started. I guess one of the things I'd be interested in, and some of you also talked about real methodological work that you're doing, whether it's qualitative and quantitative work. I'd really be interested in you reflecting on how your consideration of value within the healthcare system, your community's thinking about value has maybe evolved or changed. And Mariana, you gave some examples of what your community is thinking about now as far as value. Maybe you could dig into that a little bit further. Everyone could think about what are we looking to achieve when we say that, how will we know that something has value? And one of the, maybe also to put a little context around it, one of the things that many of us talk about and we're often struck by is that oftentimes these value assessments are conducted with the payer as the target audience, but everybody here really talked about the decisions are being made at the end of the day by the patients, and the patients in consultation with their providers. So as patient communities, how are we thinking about value?
Yeah, Annie, I can sort of talk to and sort of my role at Jdrf. Obviously, I sit on a slightly different role in that I'm not interacting with the payers, but more the regulators from my perspective, and how we have these discussions with them is around outcomes, right? And we haven't, now our patient preference study did include an attribute that was around, potentially extra monthly cost for some of these benefits. And it was not one of the preferences, if you will, that ranked. It really came down to, the hypoglycemic events and the hyperglycemic events. And really what that comes down to is what we term, or what we're calling time in range, right? It's how often your blood sugar can stay in that normal range. That's the goal. That's the goal that, we're setting for ourselves and with our clinicians, so that we can get to that hemoglobin A1C that reduces our risks of those long-term complications. So I think what patients were telling us, and what parents were telling us, and caregivers, I should say, of those with type 1, is that therapies or interventions that could help impact those were really meaningful, were really important. And unfortunately, those aren't being reported in a way, I think, and obviously the technologies used in development of therapies. We are just starting to push and require, even for Jdrf funded research, right, that CGM metrics are captured, right, and that they're part of the study design. And we're encouraging, and we're seeing the regulators also starting to ask for it, in particular for the drug development side of it. And how do you use these tools or these instruments to assess the safety and the efficacy of a drug intervention or a biologic intervention, and potentially even a cell therapy, right? And so how does that translate into clinical meaningfulness and assessments of benefits and risks, and how can we provide the regulators and the payers, quite honestly, right, the information that this is meaningful and what this means for patients. I also think we have to start to think about patient-reported outcomes in the sense that that's a priority as well. It was a priority as an outcome measure beyond hemoglobin A1C as well. It was identified as one, but what we recognized and what we saw there is that this is a chronic disease, as is so for so many. And do we have the right instruments and tools to measure that patient-reported outcome? Depending upon where you're at, I think about, how do I describe the burden that I'm carrying, or how do I describe the burden to my family? I can't. And until I joined Jdrf, I don't think I had a good appreciation for what my parents were going through until I started to hear other parents talk about, their concerns. Obviously, they were trying to shield me from that, and protect me from that. But how would I measure that? The sleepless nights, the time lost at work, and their ability to function. I know what's going on with me when I'm having a rough blood sugar day, if you will, and how it affects my ability to function and care for my children and go to work day in and day out. But I think we need, better instruments that reflect those measurements in the real world. And ones that also reflect it. I think, the clinical trial setting can be a bit different. The kind of care you get there can be a little bit different than what you may see in the real world, and better, I think, work. And we're working toward that, tool and instruments to measure patient-reported outcomes so that we can provide the data behind what's meaningful is needed in our community as well.
That's really great. Thank you. And actually, you talking about time makes me think of Hugo describing his experience also. And that time, the measure of time, how could we reduce the time being spent on navigating all of the healthcare system he's working to navigate? I don't know, Hugo, if you want to say anything about that or add to that at all.
Yeah, I appreciate Mariana's perspective because I think with the world of type 1 diabetes has seen an enormous progress in the last 10 years. I think it's really one of the greatest success stories in this space in healthcare. For me, I look at it in a slightly different lens. You think about this. When I think about value, I think about the fact that I'm self-employed, and I purchased my insurance, my health insurance, at the California Exchange, and we currently pay about $1,600 or $1,600 a month, $1,590, just to play, just to be a part of the system, just to be a part of one of the largest HMOs here in California. That amounts to about $19,000 a year. So when I think of value, I think of every time I have an interaction with healthcare, I expect to be treated as someone who contributes with $19,000 a year out of my paycheck. So I have very little patience. I don't want to come across as someone who's not empathetic, which is not who I am. But in some aspects, I have very little empathy for a system that charges as much and is quite often not patient-centric. So that's how I look at value. I think it's really about patients having to be able to have a voice, exercise that voice, partner with the clinicians, partner with the folks who are doing the work on the provider side, and others, partner with payers. In my case, that is kind of part of the big system that I'm a part of. And but really, ultimately, and I know, Annie, you talked about the fact that patients, things have shifted. We're no longer a consumer. You said something to that effect when you opened the panel. We're no longer consumers, but in some aspects, I still see myself as a consumer or someone who is paying for a service. And if that service is subpar, I am not getting my money's worth. I look at it in a very pragmatic way.
Thank you, Hugo. I want to give Nathaniel and Maggie an opportunity to answer the question about how you are looking at value and how that maybe has evolved as you've been working with the community.
Go ahead, Maggie.
Okay, I'll jump in first and then I'll hand it over. So at 6Ls, we actually engaged in 2019 during ICER's review of 3 sickle cell treatments. And in order to help them understand how our community was defining value, we launched the My Life with Sickle Cell Disease survey. Through that survey, we were able to capture some really important findings. One of them is that claims data is not reliable because what matters to patients is what's happening in the home. So often you see our patient community resort to pain treatment and home remedies to avoid going into the medical system. So until we have a reliable data, a body of data that looks at what's happening outside of the medical system as well, we are not fully capturing value. Additionally, we also captured economic impact. So we looked at their productivity, how many days of work they were missed, what their lost salary was, and it was significant. And I think, again, those measures need to be included in the framework of any assessment that's trying to define value. And then, as others had mentioned, the out-of-pocket expenses. We know for sickle cell disease, supplements are a really huge component, in addition to so many other treatments that are used for other complications. All of that needs to be considered when looking at value. And then the last thing that I wanted to discuss is there was a question in here about looking at how to collect this patient-reported data while minimizing burden. For us, we had a really positive response from our community, with it being a community-led survey. It was something very different than the clinical trials. It was something very different than the way that data is collected on the community. For our organization to lead and own the data, we felt that this was a really positive way. And so it hopes to demonstrate what a successful effort like this would continue to be in the future.
Thanks, Maggie. Nathaniel?
Yeah, so, and there's a lot of different value considerations in mental health, and I appreciate Dana mentioning what an important issue area it is. But the one that I think is most interesting that I'll focus on is measuring outcomes, because that is, I think, is kind of like the most sort of fascinating and hot topic. And so in the world of outcomes measurement, both like in sort of the clinical trials and then in clinical practice as well, it's dominated by symptom rating scales. So in FDA clinical trials, there's a handful of measures that look at clinician ratings of symptoms, like how much insomnia do you experience, how much of this kind of depressive affect do you experience. And then in clinical practice, it's really the PHQ-9, which is a 9-question form about like how bad are different kinds of depression symptoms. And that sort of almost all of measurement today is focused on those specific outcomes. And pardon the sirens in the background, I'm in New York City. It's busy out there. And the interesting thing is the ones that are mostly used in FDA trials were developed in the 60s and 70s. And the one used, the PHQ-9, was developed in the 90s. And the point I like to make is that there's an interesting thing in mental health where both the scientific community is undergoing a revolution that aligns pretty well, I think, with the patient perspective. There's actually like not like as much of a gap between the hardcore science and the patient perspective. There's actually an interesting convergence, but we're sort of undergoing this revolution at the moment. And so in the scientific community, there's an acknowledgement that most of the way we diagnose and understand mental health conditions was based on a world before neuroscience. There was people doing their best with very limited information. And right now we're undergoing, revolution in neuroscience that's reinforming the way that we understand and diagnose mental health conditions beyond just a guess at what a syndrome could be. And the symptom rating scales were sort of like organized around these pre-neuroscience syndromes. And then also in the scientific community is undergoing a revolution around treatment. They're increasingly finding that there's no such thing as an effective treatment for a mental health condition. Like people have very diverse sets of needs and experiences, and that things work differently for different people depending on that. So until recently, cognitive behavioral therapy was thought of as like the evidence-based treatment. And what they're finding is parts of all of these different techniques work for different people at different times, depending on their stage of change. And so when you bring the lived experience perspective, it then magnifies that. what people want is different based on their needs and doesn't fit into these like diagnostic categories in any sensible way. So some people actually do find symptoms highly relevant. Like, they don't want to feel depressed every day, and that is like something they'd want to work on. But other people, tend to focus way more on role functioning. Like, I want to be a good family member. I want to be a good employee and do all the work, or I just want to experience more hope and recovery or empowerment. So there's a sort of like incredible diversity, I think, around what people want out of mental health treatment that isn't captured neatly in the symptom rating scales. And the other kind of interesting thing is, I think to Hugo's ongoing point, there's also a better chance to align what's measured with what people are working on to improve. Because the symptom rating scales like aren't very meaningful. Like, oh, so my feeling of negative affect didn't improve week to week. What do I do about that? But if it's sort of framed in more positive terms around like role functioning, you'd be like, oh, maybe I'll work on this thing differently in my personal life to like with my CBT goals to start improving there as well. And one thing I wanted to, so I'll go into the sort of like what actual measures we have in the value conversation. But I think one other idea to bring out that I've heard is like the idea of a cure. That's not as much of an idea in mental health, really. Like mental health is like somewhat more like intimate to people. You don't want to like get rid of everything that comes with whatever you're experiencing. Like quite a lot of it is very intimate and important to you. And what you don't want is the distress part. So you don't want distress, but you don't want to totally eliminate, I think, the mental health aspect.
So let me ask a question, and you may be able to talk about your next piece in the answer to this question, because I'd like everyone to sort of noodle on it while you're answering the next piece. I'd love to hear from everybody, and Nathaniel, you can answer this with your next piece. What did you say? I think somebody's not. Thank you. Is as you're talking about all these measures that you're creating, how are we doing this in such a way that it's not adding to or the burden of participation in the communities or the burden of living with the diseases? These are obviously diseases and conditions that take a lot of extra work just in addition to the lived experience of being a human in 2021, which comes with its own stressors. And so now we're doing a lot of work to really ensure that patient experience is integrated into everything we're talking about, from clinical trials to regulatory review to what's important in the access setting. How are we really thinking about and understanding from patients how we do this in a way that it works into their usual daily work streams, or in a way that people want to participate? And then maybe add to that, how are we as organizations thinking about the representativeness within who's responding and participating in these focus groups and surveys and preference studies, or at least the generalizability of what we're doing. So maybe think about that for a little bit as Nathaniel's talking about the preference work and some of the survey measures.
Yeah, so I can just answer. So I think in mental health, we kind of have that easy. Mental health treatment involves homework naturally. You're supposed to be doing, mood diaries and journaling, all the kind of things that there is already built-in burden to being in therapy. That like it requires data collection. It's just not treated as such by and large, but increasingly it is actually like tons and tons of platforms now, I think, use your mood tracking and turn that into actionable steps. So I think it's basically perfectly aligned, I think. And like when you go to your visit, even like in the analog world, the therapist would ask like, so how did your homework go, kind of thing, and you like share like, oh, these are my findings. So it just sort of automates the existing process. So I think we actually have an easy version of that. And as far as the measurement heterogeneity part, I think this is a heating up an interesting area about how do you measure diverse preferences. And so there's like some interesting work around, and so there's like all sorts of scales that are starting to measure role functioning. And like, so the PROMIS set from NIH has like a robust set around how you're functioning in different domains. And then there's a focus on this idea of goal attainment scaling, where you set and then rate your own ability to have met at like basically SMART goals in between different sessions. So that is like another measure that's being explored. And I think the interesting opportunity is with the rise of computer adaptive testing, there's more of an opportunity to like hone in on the specific needs of a person and design scales around what they're interested in improving and what's most relevant for themselves, rather than just giving people like lengthy batteries trying to capture the overall preferences of like an incredibly heterogeneous population. And I think the hard measurement work then becomes like commensurability. Like, how do you make sense of comparing these different preferences and progress and goals going into the future? And I think that's good. I mean, there's a lot of different approaches, but I think that's one of the big challenges we have.
Thanks, Nathaniel. What about others as far as, Maggie, you touched on it a little bit, but others as far as how you're really working to ensure that we minimize the additional ask that we're making of communities as they participate in this, or at least we maybe balance that out among, you know, the other participation in patient registries and clinical trials. There's so much that we're right now asking our patient communities. What are we hearing from patient communities? Are people eager to be participating in this? How are we really thinking about that? And then maybe also think about efforts to ensure that what we're doing and collecting is generalizable to the broader community who is affected by the disorders we represent.
Yeah, Annie, I think that's a great point, and something that that is a major challenge for our community to understand how we can be incorporating this work into all the other efforts that are going on. And I think the solution to that is collaboration. We need everyone at the table to really be having this discussion. We need payers, manufacturers, employers, patient groups to be sitting there and determining exactly what data is important, but then how will we be collecting it so it's not repetitive, and that we know ultimately when this data is collected that it will be used to improve access for our community.
That's great. Thanks, Maggie. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? You don't have to. We'll move on to another question. Okay. So we did have a question around how can, and you mentioned it a little bit, Maggie, around including employers being invited into these discussions. We recently actually did a national economic burden of rare disease study and worked with many patient communities in that study, and found that one of the cost drivers in rare disease is actually productivity losses, which aligns with a lot of what we're talking about here. So the cost drivers we're seeing aren't in the direct costs, but in a lot of the themes that we're talking about here, which to us really means that we really need employer groups at the table when we're having conversations around where the opportunities are. I'd be interested in, and if the answer is no, that just means there's a big opportunity to be working with employer groups, but to what end any of your communities have been working with employers and employer groups when really navigating some of these access discussions and actually looking at some of the data that you're collecting?
Annie, I'm happy to chime in because
Sure.
we did have a good amount of experience with back when continuous glucose monitors were originally approved by the FDA. They weren't being covered, right? They weren't being reimbursed, and we had some challenges there. And we went and talked to the payers to help understand really sort of what was missing and what they needed. And we did an important study that I think brought the additional data that they needed in order to get coverage. And we have broad coverage from Medicare and many private insurer plans, but that did also take some work to talk to the employers, right? Because some of the plans had been making some decisions that were providing preference to one pump or a certain type of insulin, and our coverage to control campaign was really targeting and helping to advocate for choices for patients so that patients could pick and their families and caregivers could choose the best components of a system or the best treatment options along with their physicians, what worked for them, that this wasn't just a decision by a payer that just allowed for one pump that may not go down to a certain age, right, or may not be able to dose insulin in increments that would be needed for how you're taking your insulin. So we really had to bring the employers to and have our advocates and our patients really sit down with their employers and have those discussions, those important discussions about why these are meaningful and how they impacted their lives. And I think the overall outcome was positive in terms of helping to make sure that there's broad coverage for and that patients and their families have the right choices to make those decisions. So extremely essential and important to have, I think, employers, especially the large employers who are making decisions on which benefits. Not all the plans are the same, and we had to do some education around with our community as well around sometimes what's covered under sort of a broad payer plan may not be covered because your employer may have not opted in to provide that coverage. And if they don't know that this is important to you and your family, or they may not have a sense of how many people, right, or how many of your kids have type 1 diabetes within their organization, and that, you know, providing this coverage actually is of benefit to them and a cost savings. You know, we really had to provide education to our community and to bring the employers in and to educate them as well.
That's great. Thank you, Mariana. I suspect that that you are a really rare example. I think probably that's a nascent space for a lot of patient advocacy groups to be working with employers. So I think that's really an area of opportunity as we go through the day today to think about where there are opportunities for partnership and alignment. I think we're coming to the end of the time, but I would love to almost do a lightning round to just better understand where are the resource barriers and opportunities, because this takes a lot of work on the part of patient advocacy organizations and groups to do this work. And so my first question would be, like, are you readily resourced to do this work? Does everyone have the in-house capacity to do this? And if not, what types of resources would you need to continue and to reinforce this work? Because I think that's something that's really important for us to talk about, to say, you know, what are the barriers to continuing this engagement as we lean into how we do more and better?
Well, I can go. To me, it's the most obvious opportunity there is with patients and caregivers. To echo the mantra of the Society for Participatory Medicine, it's let patients help. Create systems, put systems in place that incentivize more accountability, more control, taking a bigger role, perhaps even reimburse patients and caregivers to do some of the work that we already are doing. There may be some opportunities there.
Phenomenal. Let patients help. Great. Thank you, Hugo. Maggie?
Yeah, for us, we are a very small organization, so it's an incredible burden on our small organization to do this kind of work. And so there really needs to be adequate reimbursement for our time and our effort engaging in these projects. We did a rough calculation of what it was to field that survey and engage with ICER over the course of, I think it was like a 7-month review, and it was about $60,000 it costed our organization. Part of that is we contracted 2 health economists to help us with the expertise that we needed. And I think that's a big part of it as well. So going back to what I said about collaboration and partnerships, I think if everyone is at the table, if everyone is representing their expertise, then I think that helps reduce the burden on patients to be able to do it all.
Thank you, Maggie. And I love that you actually took the time to do that back of the envelope calculation on what it costs to engage. It's really important. Nathaniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that. That was kind of what I was thinking too for both of you, is like, there's this issue where like often like you bring patients to speak and then they just like, if you don't perfectly couch it in the terms of the decision context, everyone's like, oh, these were great thoughts, and then it doesn't get translated into action because nobody knows what to do with it. And so I think like in all of these things, like the things we don't have resources for is like the friendly psychometrician and the friendly health economist and the friendly health services researcher who helps turn, like, I can like say item response theory with an almost straight face, but like, I don't know, I can't like work to create better PROs. But if we had people that were better equipped to translate the patient experience in these rooms and on their side, I think that would really help translate a lot of this into action.
Phenomenal, thank you. And Mariana.
Thanks, Annie. I think as I think about, when we're talking about patient preference, and we're fortunate enough to have folks like myself and a health policy team at Jdrf, but it is resource intensive. And you think about, I want to make sure that what we're doing and that the patient preferences that we're eliciting and that we're eliciting by doing these types of work in this survey actually leads to meaningful change on the regulatory front, on the reimbursement front. There's, and making sure sometimes that the research that we're funding and what we're capturing meets the needs of the decision makers, because there's a lot of them. And I can appreciate that there isn't going to be a sort of a one size fits all. And I think our communities and our patients and our caregivers are very much willing to do the work, to participate in the surveys, to provide their perspectives and their input. But to Nathaniel's point, that it does, get incorporated into the decision-making process. And I think that's a little bit still of a black box, right? Is that, we come prepared, we come to provide our experiences and our lived experiences. We come with data. I think about myself, I'm walking around, I'm more than happy to share my continuous glucose monitor data. Now that's a little bit isolated in that it's just giving you the numbers. It's not giving you the whole picture of what's going on. And I'd be happy if there were questions coming up throughout the day that would be able to capture that. But to others' points, right, we need the experts who are able to sort of help us do that, but also making sure that the various decision makers, and that chart was really telling with how many there are, that this information meets their needs, and it does get incorporated into how value is assessed and how drugs are developed and how they're approved and how we get access to them when that does happen.
Great, thank you. So I just want to take a moment to thank the panelists today and IVI for setting this up. I think everybody really spoke perfectly to what today is about. The patient experience is data and should be incorporated centrally in the methodologies that are informing the decisions, that are informing value, because ultimately a therapy that is not accessible has no value. So we thank everybody for being a part of this panel and really helping articulate that and bring that to life. And thank you to IVI, and I'm going to turn it back to Elisa.